You are making a quilt top and you are faced with an array of needles in your shop and you don't know what to buy. Let me try and give you a bit more information to help you choose the needle that is appropriate for the job that you are doing. Sewing machine needles range from very fine to very heavy duty. If you imagine you were sewing a leather saddle, you would need an incredibly robust needle. But in a domestic situation, we generally only see needles that are suitable for sewing very fine silk up to a heavy duty canvas. And the higher the number, the thicker, the heavier duty, the more robust the needle is. So again, in a domestic situation, the finest needle we would probably see would be a size 60, which, as I said, we would use for sewing silk or delicate fabrics. And we might see 100, maybe 110 or 120 if you were making a canvas bag or repairing a tent or, I don't know, something like that, okay? And the numbering system is perhaps a little more complex than I'm going to say, but generally what you see is size 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 and so on. You can get half sizes, so there are 65s and 75s and so on. And it's also kind of, think of it as metric imperial. A 60, it's 60/8, it's 70/10, it's 80/12. Look at any range of sewing machine packets and you will see that information. So that is a little bit about sizing, but in addition to that, there are needles for all kinds of different types of fabrics and threads. So for example, a universal needle does exactly what it says. It will sew the majority of fairly regular types of fabric, so cottons and wools and not really lightweight silks but heavyweight silks, just general kind of fabrics. But you can get things like a ballpoint needle, which is designed specifically for sewing knitted fabrics and jerseys, and instead of having a very sharp point, it has a slightly rounded tip so that it doesn't pierce the knit thread and cause a run in the fabric. And then you get different types of needles according to thread. So for example, a metallic needle is designed specifically to sew metallic threads, which can be a little bit of a challenge through the sewing machine. And that needle has a very large eye, and the reason for that is it helps to stop friction and shredding of those threads as the thread passes repeatedly through the eye of the needle before it actually finishes up forming the stitch. You get embroidery needles that have a groove and again an eye to help stop shredding. So there are lots of different types of needles for different fabrics and different threads. But let's just talk about making a quilt top. I tend to use a very fine needle, and I use what's called a Microtex needle. And a Microtex needle is a finer needle than a universal needle, so it has a finer blade, that is the long bit that the groove of the needle is in, and it has a sharp point, and I like it because it penetrates the layers of fabric very easily and very precisely. And if any of you have ever sewn with a very tightly woven batik type fabric, something like that, you may have discovered that with something like a 70 or an 80 universal needle, you've got what's called needle damage, where every time the needle takes a stitch, it pierces and breaks a thread in the weave of the fabric because the needle is too big to get between the fibers of the weave, which is what it should be doing. You can see, can't you, that a fine Microtex needle is much more likely to get between the fibers of the weave without damaging them. So I tend to use a 60 or a 70 Microtex needle when I'm creating a quilt top. And I think that if you are piecing, you are joining your fabrics with anything bigger than a 70, It's too big for those lightweight, not heavy duty cotton fabrics that we use most often to make our quilt tops. And the other reason that I particularly like it is that the blade, the long bit of the needle, is slim, and so as the needle is going into the plies of fabric, it is going through on the downward motion and on the upward motion, and it's not grabbing and holding on to those fabric plies, and so the threads are able to lock together without this distortion of being kind of pulled up and down with the fabric, and you get really good tension with it. So that is why I use really fine needles. And I find when I'm doing something like a plique, and let's say I'm doing a turned edge leaf shape, and I've got seam allowance turned under on the point of an applique motif, I find that very fine needle penetrates through those layers really easily. Lots of you will have tried this with a thicker, more kind of universal ordinary needle and found that the needle will not go down through those plies. So lots of really great reasons for using it. But you do need to match the thickness of your thread to the size of your needle. So you cannot use a heavy duty thread with a very fine needle. It will not sew, you'll break your needle, tension will be off. And so I tend to use very fine threads for my piecing, and it allows me to get really, really precise results. I don't get bulk of thread stopping me getting really good matching. So with my fine needle, I'm using fine thread, and I will talk about threads in another one of these little things, but just so you know, I tend most often to use superior threads, 60 weight bottom line polyester thread in the bobbin, and I use superior threads 100 weight kimono silk in the top of my sewing machine. With that fine needle, I get really super, really precise results to be really proud of. So I hope that gives you a little bit more of an overview of sewing machine needles, and that if you are not sewing with a 70, you are using a bigger needle for piecing your quilt tops, try a 70 needle with a finer thread, see how you get on. I think you will find it makes a positive difference. If you've enjoyed that information and found it interesting, I teach a huge range of quilting classes through quiltersquestiontime.com, starting with a beginner quilters class that takes you through the entire process from start to finish, and Series 1 Quilters Question Time, the transformational series designed to transform your quilting and take your enjoyment and the results that you make to the next level. quiltersquestiontime.com.